So I prepared a short presentation, which is articulating both a personal view of Tom Mitchell's work on iconology, and which is mostly based on a paper I wrote in English 2 years ago, especially on his iconology. So I chose the title Iconology as Political Philosophy. It's obviously linked with W.J.T. Mitchell's Iconology as Political Philosophy, but at the end of my talk, I will try also to switch. That is not just to present in order to open the afternoon the base sum of the basic aspects of W.J.T. Mitchell's iconology and the differences between different versions and basic aspects of his visual theory, but also to give a more personal perspective on this connection between iconology and politics. Among Tom Mitchell's countless investigations into the lives, into the loves, into the powers, and into the desires of images for more than 40 years, politics has always played a very important role. This chapter of his Iconology, just republished, as said by Nicolas, by les Éditions Amsterdam in September. The chapter of his Iconology devoted to Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and his considerations on the artistic frontiers between poetry and painting, similar to nation-state borders, or the essay focused on Edmund Burke's aesthetic theory as a framework to enable a kind of deep rereading of Edmund Burke's later critiques of the French Revolution, are the very first examples of a brand new research program for political iconology. And according to Mitchell, politics is more than a struggle between men, between women, of course, for power or for leadership or for equality. It is inscribed at the very core of the relationship between text and images, pictures, and words. His intellectual work has coped with many different aspects of politics, from the Abu Ghraib archives of the War on Terror during the year 2000 to various spaces of representation and non-representation. Here is one example, Thomas Gainsborough, Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, about 1750, illustrating Tom Mitchell's considerations on landscape, which are deeply rooted in a critical tradition going back to the analysis of 18th century painting by other critics from the English-speaking world, like Raymond Williams or John Berger, famous writer who wrote Ways of Seeing during the 1970s. Williams and Berger, who famously criticized the display of the English countryside with its owner, but without the peasants who actually produce it. We see the owners, we don't see the peasants who were working on the land. Therefore, to paraphrase another thinker of space named Henri Lefebvre, who famously said about Karl Marx that Karl Marx is not a sociologist, but that there is a sociology in Marxism, one could say that Tom Mitchell is not a political philosopher, but that there is a political philosophy in his iconology. And one of the illustrations of this contention is the foreword by Marie-Josée Monzin, mentioned by Nicolas during this presentation. Marie-Josée Monzin wrote, for example, at the beginning of foreword, she has this contention: iconology brings Iconology, the book, not the science or the science of image, the book in itself, brings together the icon and the logos, iconicity and language under the double regime of their alliances and their disjunctions, even their conflicts. Iconology must be in itself an art of encounter between heterogeneous sites, something like the enigma of a love encounter, the art of producing relationships between things without any common ground. Alliances, disjunctions, conflicts never cease to change in the course of social and cultural history. That's why this book is political. Iconology defends the irreducible historicity of our imaginary production and the reducible historicity of the ways we give account of this production. The English translation is mine. It's not perfect, but you have the original in French, so for most of you it's easier to read the original version, and you may grasp with this short example, quotation, how this iconology is made political by its application. And Monzin finishes forward with another quotation which is especially interesting. Theorists, visual theorists especially, are almost always men whose manly knowledge does hardly recognize that images and imagination occupy a site where all disjunctions, all differences, all contradictions are blurred. So, general basic understanding of the relationship between philosophy, political philosophy, and iconology. That's Monzin's version of her personal look at this theory, at Tom Mitchell's theory. Personally, I would like to explore here today some specific implication of political philosophy linked to iconology. In my opinion, many different aspects of Mitchell's work can be scrutinized through one single lens, and I have to confess that while I was musing on this talk for today, I felt scared many times to use it insofar as it is loaded with blurred meanings and violent political debates. And what a surprise for me to find it at work in one of the latest book by Tom Mitchell entitled Image Science, published in 2015. In a chapter extending another dialogue that with Monzin met with Jacques Rancière, and it's no coincidence at all. In a description of the classical biblical episode of the golden calf constructed by the Jewish people, by the Israelites in the Sinai desert. This scene, here painted by Nicolas Poussin, l'Adoration du Veau d'Or, vers 1634. This scene, commented by Tom Mitchell, so often denounced as the prime example of idolatry, but paradoxically depicted in numerous pictures, such as this famous painting at the National Gallery today, might also be read as a good example of populist democracy in action, with the people self-consciously commissioning a visible sign of their sacred unity as a nation. And so this painting, often regarded elsewhere by Mitchell, for example, as what he calls a meta-picture, that is, a picture showing the conditions of possibility of pictures. Here, a painting showing a sculpture, a statue, that is, a picture of a picture and a picture of the way pictures are celebrated and the place they have in our everyday lives. That's, in a quick summary, what a meta-picture is. So this painting finds with the notion of populism quite disturbing new interpretation. And populism is the keyword I would like to deal with today, with one basic aim, to show how it can connect on Mitchell's politics of vision and iconology in general to politics as such. I will indicate how classical accounts of populism are embedded to some extent in an iconology, very close to common descriptions of the episode of the golden calf. In other words, there is a strong relationship between populism and idolatry, understood as two plagues which should be denounced and even eradicated. I will also muse on the similarities of Mitchell's insight with the path-breaking account on populism and democracy given by another Argentinian philosopher named Ernesto Laclau, in order to show that both thinkers have redefined idolatry and populism as a positive framework for politics, for visual interpretation, and no longer as something to condemn. And in the end, in conclusion, I will try to explain a personal view of populism, that is how populism is not just something which can be applied to politics, but also to knowledge, and how one could define a certain kind of populist attitude in knowledge, that is in the intellectual area, and how populism could be framed, reinterpreted, redefined in order to match the question of visual interpretation and visual critique. So, let me start with a basic rhetorical account on the word populism today. It is one of the most loaded terms in contemporary politics and public debate, as you probably all know. It connotes the corruption of a naive people driven into madness and false representations by a charismatic leader, either from the extreme left or the extreme right. That is, therefore, it implies very often that the only democratic parties and programs in representative democracies are located near the center of the political chessboard. That is, the conservatives and the social democrats in Western representative democracies. And the alternatives are restricted to two main options, like in France before the election of Emmanuel Macron, the Socialists and the Republicans, two parties, although these two choices may appear to be very close together as soon as one looks at their respective economical programs from a wider perspective. And this blurring is probably what is epitomized by the election of Emmanuel Macron on the one hand, and it's also something like a populist sin to express it. That's my first point. That is, when you say that people on the right side and people on the left side are the same, and when you express that in public debates, you may be qualified as a populist. That is, somebody who is trying to blur, not saying that everything is already blurred, but trying to blur the differences between the left and the right. But that's not really important. The important part of this question of populism is that the rhetoric of populism is rooted as in an iconology. In a short article originally published in 2011, ahead of the French presidential election of 2012, the philosopher Jacques Rancière argued that the term populism is not used today to characterize any well-defined political force. It denotes neither an ideology nor even a current political style. It serves simply to draw the image of a certain people. End of quotation. This image is perfectly drawn indeed. The people represented in it are supposed to be as dangerous today as they were during the second half of the 19th century, when the ideological process described by Argentinian philosopher Ernesto Laclau as a denigration of the masses began. Drawing on brand new fields of knowledge such as criminology and psychology, writers like Hippolyte Taine and Gustave Le Bon started to use metaphors in order to analogize the crowd to a bunch of hysterical women, for example. To quote the title of a classic text on this topic by intellectual historian, American historian Susanna Barrows, they used madness they used gender, and they used alcoholism as distorting mirrors to sketch what they feared to be a realistic image of the people. Along these lines, a second iconological and ideological connection is worth highlighting. The distorted image of the people produced at the end of the 19th century was also, to some extent, an image of an idolatrous people, driven mad by what Tom Mitchell would call a pictorial turn, that is, a tendency to mistranslate discourses into images, an inability to get the right meaning behind the words of politics. In other words, it was not sufficient to draw a distorted picture of the people framed by and for those able to look at it. That is, Gustave Le Bon, for example, and also, of course, his readers, who saw crowds becoming like the Sphinx of ancient fable, and who were scared of being devoured by them. It's the first quotation in the English version and the original. It was not sufficient. It was also important to frame a vision of crowds as multitude producing images from language. And there is this second quotation, which is very important, and it's also, to some extent, kind of incarnation, epitomization, of W.J.T. Mitchell's definition of iconology as a struggle between words and images. And the quotation by Le Bon is that the power of words is bound up with the images they evoke and is quite independent of their real significance. That is, Le Bon has a general theory of the relationships between words and images. He says that images have certain use, certain possibility, certain ability, and it's the same thing for images. And the basic definition of the relationship between words and images is a background, is a ground, general ground, in order to build a political theory. That is, you begin by theorizing the relationship between words and images, and then you build a whole political theory on it. For Le Bon, individuals are working with words, crowds are thinking with pictures. That is, as far as reason is on the side of words, crowds cannot think by themselves. So they are delegitimated as political subjects, and that's the basic fact of what is called populism. That is, crowds cannot think rationally and by themselves. And that's a general construction of the end of the 19th century. That is, what is called populism today is something which has been invented at a certain moment and which is linked with certain knowledges in criminology, in sociology, in psychology. It has a history, and that's the basic point. Therefore, populism understood as a sin, negatively, not positively, is the perfect modern heir of classical idolatry for describing people, back to Poussin, for describing people going crazy through the veneration of a wrong image instead of the true word of God. And we are back in front of Poussin's The Adoration of the Golden Calf, which is another picture, classical picture, showing what idolatry is, as W.J.T. Mitchell has routinely insisted in his writings. So the fact that the picture is to some extent a visual rendering of populist democracy is established, and I just want now to make understandable how it can be a positive description of the democratic impulse. It would be too long to produce that as a political theory, so I just want to say that one way to continue to produce this theory would be to compare Tom Mitchell's thesis with the writings of Ernesto Laclau, already quoted, the philosopher who, in parallel with Jacques Rancière, has given the most powerful insights into what populism can mean beyond the historical denigration I have described above. According to Laclau, populism is not a threat, it is a basic mechanism of politics which was portrayed as something dangerous at the very moment of the rise of a social class, the proletariat, at the end of the 19th century, the working class, as a new political subject. Redefined by means of a close historical examination and philosophical reconceptualization, which I can only sum up here, populism becomes not a fixed constellation, but what Laclau calls a series of discursive resources which can be put to very different uses by very different actors on the political chessboard, and not just the extreme left or the extreme right, but also Macron and all the people at the supposed center. In his political philosophy, Laclau says that heterogeneous demands by collective subjects are articulated together to produce what he called equivalential chains, as far as they share a common element in a given political situation, despite their heterogeneity. And this political theory is illustrated in some way by the Occupy Wall Street movement of 2011, and especially by the political slogan, "We are the 99%. That is, Laclau says there is a gathering around heterogeneous political actors which are not supposed to talk to each other and to struggle with each other, find a kind of what he calls an empty signifier, that is something in which they all can recognize themselves around one single thing. And this thing is opposed to another thing which produces a political antagonism. And Laclau describes that as a basic mechanism of politics. That is, 99% of the population gathers together against 1%, and the 99% is wanting more healthcare, is wanting more wealth redistribution, is wanting abolition of student fees. That was one of the major contention of the students, part of the Occupy Wall Street movement. Of course, they want help for the homeless, they want environmental protection, they want something for the animals, they want so on, so on. That is, they are very different, but they find one slogan, one aspect, producing a unity, that is 99%. So, an illustration of what is at stake in Ernesto Laclau's political theory, and an illustration of the connection with iconology as political philosophy. That is, the flag 99%, like the molten calf as a statue in Poussin's painting, it's the thing which appears in order to produce the unity of the people gathered in the scene. So, in order to continue, my aim is not to discuss the erudite and meticulous explanation of politics produced by Laclau and even by Mitchell, but to sketch the basic outlines of these common views which are summarized, illustrated in one single picture. In Mitchell's term, the biblical episode of the golden calf is, I already mentioned the concept, it is a meta-picture. That is, it is a picture of what pictures are and of the idolatrous and iconoclastic reactions they can provoke. But the reading of the scene, of the biblical scene, as populist democracy actually frames for us two brand new meta-pictures which are useful to comment. On the one hand, in Poussin's painting, so a painting from the 17th century, supposed to represent something completely different than contemporary populism, in order to rephrase my thought. On the one hand, we have populism precisely in its redefined form, so to speak, that is a staging of a people begotten, constructed, or to use Ernesto Laclau's word, constituted. It is fundamental insofar as it is not only a reversal of a classical understanding of the phenomenon of populism, but also a total reframing of the latent iconology that has structured it from the very beginning. That is, there is a visual theory behind the classical concept of populism, the visual theory of Le Bon and his readers and his fellows, that is a certain kind of denigration of visibility. And this denigration is also overturned by a different interpretation of Poussin's painting as an illustration of what populism could mean differently. We have here a meta-picture of the process of redefinition. That is, a former vision of populism becoming a new one, which is precisely the turn highlighted by Mitchell from populist idolatry to populist democracy. And in Laclau's view, it is how a denigration of the masses, the classical denigration of the masses from the 19th century, becomes a certain form of political reason. That is, there is a reason in crowds, but it's not the same reason than the rationalistic reason linked to individuals. It is another kind of reason, and it is the basic reason which can be applied to politics. And the second meta-picture is therefore also pretty much evident. It is a meta-picture of Laclau's theory. Laclau, just to put the thing in one sentence, is a major philosopher inspired by the structuralist tradition. That is somebody who is producing his whole political theory with the basic background of language. Everything is language. Everything is, for example, empty signifier. En français, version originale signifiant vide, c'est-à-dire, je ne rentre pas dans le détail, it would not be interesting to go ahead with what an empty signifier is, but the important thing is that when Laclau wants to produce his theory, he's using something which is referring to narratives, text, literature, language, sentence, etc. It's not on the side of visibility, it's on the side of textual knowledges. And therefore, what is interesting in the basic overturning of populist idolatry into a populist democracy, it's precisely the way it catches vision at the very core of the process. That is, Le Bon was working with words and denigrating pictures, and Laclau was working with words and trying to reconceptualize populism, but he wasn't working with vision, visuality, and pictures. And that, according to me, is one of the major achievements of Tom Mitchell's Iconology, that is the opportunity to go through pictures in order to understand the process. That is how the classical sin of idolatry has to be deconstructed, so to speak, in order to understand not only our common relationship to pictures, but our common relationship to basic politics. That is, it's not a matter of a better understanding of classical pictures. It's the basic understanding of what populism means and how we catch the notion, how we use the notion, and how the notion is used in order to produce a certain kind of government, to be clear. And in order to conclude, j'ai encore un peu de temps. Populism, therefore, has a history. Populism has effects in contemporary politics, and it is possible, using iconology understood as political philosophy, to go through and to re-grasp this history. That is, producing visual knowledges not in order to understand how pictures work, not for our aesthetic pleasure, not producing visual knowledges framed for academic disciplines like art history and so on, but thinking with images, we're thinking basic knowledges linked with vision in order to reconceptualize what politics is today. But a specific aspect of this process is also linked with the question of knowledge and also the question of aesthetics, of course. While working on this connection between populist idolatry, populist democracy, and how to reconceptualize the whole thing, I've been working on an artist, a British artist named Jeremy Deller. You probably know his work, especially one of the pictures I've added to my PowerPoint, which is taken from his reenactment of the Battle of Orgreave. The Battle of Orgreave is a reenactment of 2001 of a major miners' strike which occurred in Britain during the 1980s, during the long moment when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister of England, and the moment when she decided to block the major unions, especially the unions of the miners' unions. And in 1984 occurred what is called now the Battle of Orgreave, that is a huge repression of the miners demonstrating by the police, and major fights inside the city, but also fights in the country. And Jeremy Deller in 2001 decided to produce a reenactment with former actors of that political situation. And in 2012, for an exhibition catalogue by Jeremy Deller, British cultural studies theorician Stuart Hall produced a text in which he tried to explain what is at stake with the artistic and visual production by Deller. And Hall says the following thing. He says, there is something linked with a kind of radical populism in English politics during the 19th century. It's a very complicated form of politics, linked with nationalism, linked with many different things. And Hall says these connections can be made in order to understand what is at stake in Deller's work, but it's not exactly true. He says Deller does not have much truck with the kind of nationalism, for example, associated with 19th century English radical populism. That is just one kind of political practice named populism, among others. But there is something deeper in the vernacular that profoundly animates his imagination, and that's the important point. He says, it is this idea. In Deller's work, people who are sometimes considered to be unimportant or not worth listening to matter. They are creative, but often have their creativity denied or taken away from them. He believes they should be valued for what they are, their voices heard, their practices celebrated, and that one way of doing that is to redeploy them as sources of new artistic work in a modern idiom. And I discovered that while working on populism, on images of crowds. I discovered also Hall's text essay while working on visual knowledges, while I was writing a short introduction to what is called visual culture studies, an academic research program Tom Mitchell helped to construct during the 1980s. And I was struck by one thing, two things, actually. The first one is that what Stuart Hall is saying about Jeremy Deller can be applied to Stuart Hall as a sociologist. Stuart Hall is somebody who thinks that people who are sometimes considered to be unimportant or not worth listening to matter. They are creative, but often have their creativity denied or taken away from them. That is, Hall is not just talking about Deller, he's also talking about himself, he's also talking about a certain kind of political attitude inscribed inside knowledge itself. And I was struck by another aspect, that is, as far as you open the framework in order to develop this political attitude not just toward people, but also toward images themselves, there is the opportunity to grasp a certain kind of political attitude, and for me it's precisely what defines political iconology as political philosophy, as Professor Mitchell helped to entail. And it could be rephrased like this: there is something deeper that profoundly animates Tom Mitchell's imagination and this political iconology. It is this idea that images which are sometimes considered to be unimportant or not worth listening to matter. These images are creative, but often have their creativity denied or taken away from them, and taken away from them by people like art critics or art historians, who think they have the knowledge themselves and who apply their personal knowledge to images. And it's the same mechanism for sociologists who apply their knowledges to people. That is, they decide by themselves what is interesting and what is true and what is, etc., etc. And there is this fundamental displacement of the political attitude inside knowledge, the moment when you think that the things you have in front of you are creative, but often have their creativity denied, taken away, and that they should be valued for what they are, that their voices should be heard, that their practices should be celebrated, and that one way for pictures of doing that is to redeploy them as sources of a new visual theory, paying attention, in this case, to archaic beliefs like classical idolatry. As I've tried to show, classical archaic idolatry, classical idolatry can be, by paying a close attention, reconceptualized in order to regrasp what is at stake in our political situation outside just the short field of visual theory. And I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.